How did the Vikings survive without clean living conditions? It is a strange question because it sounds almost backwards. We are used to imagining survival as something that belongs to the wild, to storms at sea, to raids, hunger, winter, or war. But one of the greatest tests of Viking endurance was much closer than the horizon. It was the air they breathed indoors, the floors they slept beside, the waste they lived near, the parasites that moved through their homes, their animals, and sometimes their own bodies. And yet they survived. That is the mystery. Because when archaeologists dig into Viking settlements, they do not uncover a polished world of heroic cleanliness. They uncover smoke-blackened interiors, damp floors, insect remains, lice, fleas, moldering plant matter, human waste, and parasite eggs. In York, environmental evidence from Viking-age layers shows human fleas and lice on house floors, foul living conditions, house flies, and pits containing human feces filled with parasitic worm eggs. In Denmark, archaeologists even identified what may be the oldest known Viking toilet in the country, a deep Viking-age pit whose lowest layer proved to be human waste. So here's the real puzzle. How did a people so often linked with rough, crowded, smoky, and unsanitary environments manage not only to endure, but to expand across the North Atlantic, build towns, raise families, and leave a civilization strong enough to terrify Europe? The answer is that the Vikings did not survive because they were clean in the modern sense. They survived because they were practical. They built routines that made dirt manageable. They accepted conditions we would call unhealthy, but they also created systems of grooming, washing, food storage, waste control, and household order that prevented disorder from becoming total collapse. Their world was not sterile, it was controlled just enough. And that makes them more interesting than the myth. The popular stereotype says, Vikings were filthy barbarians. Archaeology says something more complicated. The National Museum of Denmark notes that combs of wood or bone are among the most common Viking finds. Many were kept in boxes, suggesting they were valued and protected. Tweezers and earpicks are also common finds, and wear marks on teeth indicate that toothpicks were used. In other words, a people who lived among smoke and insects still cared deeply about personal appearance and bodily maintenance. That contradiction is the key to the whole story, because the Viking world could be dirty without being indifferent to dirt. Take the Viking house. In farm settlements, the longhouse was the center of life. It sheltered people, work, food preparation, storage, and at times animals as well. According to the National Museum of Denmark, Viking longhouses had an oblong fireplace in the middle, plank beds along the walls, and in some cases stalls for animals at one end of the building, but there were no chimneys and no windows. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. The result was a house full of lingering smoke, with poor ventilation and conditions that modern health comparisons associate with lung disease. So the first thing a Viking household had to survive was home itself. Imagine that interior for a moment. Fire in the center, meat, broth, porridge, or bread being prepared, wet clothing drying, people sleeping along the walls, animals close enough to be heard, smelled, and tended. Roof smoke hanging low, ash settling, dirt carried in on footwear, organic scraps being dropped, swept, moved, or reused. This was not an occasional hardship. This was ordinary domestic life. And ordinary life leaves the deepest evidence. At Coppergate in Viking Age York, archaeologists recovered exactly the kind of evidence that myths cannot hide. Human fleas and lice were found in house floor deposits. Large insect assemblages pointed to moldering plant remains and fairly foul living conditions. The floors were not dry by modern standards. Houseflies thrived there too. Yet the same evidence also suggests that people used woodland litter and plant materials for floor covering, and that in later phases some planked houses became cleaner and drier. That matters. It shows that Viking households were not passive victims of filth. They were constantly managing it, improving it, and adapting to it. But the deeper you dig, the uglier it gets. Those same York deposits reveal pits with human feces containing large numbers of parasitic worm eggs. Some pits may also preserve evidence of materials used for sanitary purposes, including fragments of woolen yarn and large branching mosses. That single detail is easy to miss, but it is extraordinary. It suggests that even in a world far from modern plumbing, Viking Age communities were using practical wiping materials and organizing waste into specific places, rather than simply living in undifferentiated filth. That is where the documentary changes direction, because survival did not depend on making life spotless. It depended on making dirt predictable. One reason Viking society could endure harsh living conditions is that dirt was woven into labor and routine. Waste was removed to pits. Floors were covered and renewed. Houses were repaired constantly because damp caused rot. Food scraps were reused, fed to animals, composted, or discarded. Domestic animals were valuable, and their presence could increase dirt, insects, and smell, but also provided milk, meat, hides, wool, transport, and status. The Viking household was not divided into clean and unclean in the modern way. It was an economy where almost everything useful came attached to mess. And that meant cleanliness had to be selective. The Vikings could tolerate smoky rooms and damp floors, but they still paid attention to the body itself. The archaeological record is full of grooming tools. Combs appear again and again, tweezers appear again and again, ear picks appear again and again. The Viking Ship Museum notes that combs, tweezers, ear scoops, even toiletry items for nails, and evidence of toothpick use all point to a people who thought about hygiene and appearance. The museum also notes a bowl from Kaupang in Norway that may have been used for hand washing before meals, marked with runes identifying it as a hand-washing bowl. So even in a grimy world, the face mattered, the hands mattered, the hair mattered. The Vikings may not have had modern sanitation, but they understood presentation, grooming, and bodily order. In England, they were remembered as attractive partly because they bathed on Saturdays, combed their hair, and dressed well. The National Museum of Denmark explicitly notes that Viking men reportedly had success with local women because they were clean, pleasant-smelling, and well-groomed. An anonymous Old English writer even warned his brother against adopting Danish fashion. That complaint is more revealing than any compliment. People do not warn against fashion unless it is persuasive. But then another witness gives us the other side. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab observer who encountered the Rus, described them in a way that sounds almost impossible beside the English complaints. He called them filthy, and the Viking Ship Museum preserves his famous account of a communal washing basin. One man washing his face, hands, and hair, then combing over the same bowl, blowing his nose, spitting, and passing the water to the next man. To a Muslim observer with strong ritual expectations about washing, this seemed revolting. And here, suddenly, the contradiction becomes clear. The Vikings were not clean or unclean in one simple way. They could be careful about grooming and careless about shared water. They could bathe weekly and still live with worms. They could treasure combs while sleeping in smoky, insect-ridden rooms. They could look impressive in public and still accept conditions indoors that a modern person would find intolerable. That is the truth hiding behind the stereotype. Their cleanliness was cultural, not clinical, and the culture of survival extended far beyond grooming. Written sources from the Norse world show that hospitality itself involved cleansing. In Havamal, one of the most important surviving Old Norse texts, the traveler who arrives at a home chilled to the knee needs fire, food, and clothing. Another stanza says the guest who comes to a meal needs water, a towel, and a warm welcome. These lines are not just poetic niceties. They show that washing, drying, warming, and feeding belong to the basic ritual of receiving a person from the outside world. A body came in carrying cold, dust, mud, and exhaustion. The household answered with fire and water. So survival began at the doorway. It is easy to underestimate how important that is. If a society turns washing and drying into part of hospitality, then cleanliness is no longer a luxury. It becomes one of the first acts that restore a traveler, a guest, or a family member returning from work. In a wet northern climate, drying can matter as much as washing. In a smoky house, removing soot and sweat from skin and hair is not vanity. It is recovery. But recovery also required controlling waste. That is why the toilet evidence matters so much. The Viking Age pit discovered at Stevens in Denmark is important not just because it may be Denmark's oldest known toilet, but because it challenges the assumption that rural Viking communities simply relieved themselves anywhere convenient. The archaeologists involved said the find forced them to rethink toilet habits on Viking farms. In urban settings, privies from the later Viking age were already known. Now there was evidence that at least some rural settlements also set aside dedicated spaces for human waste. That may sound like a small achievement. It was not. The difference between random waste and designated waste is the difference between constant contamination and limited contamination. It does not eliminate disease, but it reduces chaos. It creates distance. It creates routine. It creates the possibility of maintenance. And Viking life seems full of exactly those small routines, not enough to meet modern health standards, but enough to make settlement possible over generations. Even their drinking habits reveal the same logic. The National Museum of Denmark notes that water could be dangerous to drink in the Viking period, which is why both weak and strong beer were produced. Weak beer could be consumed by children as well as adults. This is one of those facts that sounds quaint until you realize what it means. A society living with contaminated water, waste, animals, and stored organic matter needed safer ways to hydrate. Fermented drink was not just pleasure. It was practical chemistry. So the cup on the table was part of survival too, food. Preservation mattered just as much. The Vikings dried and salted meat and fish for long-term use. Heavily salted butter and preserved dairy products helped carry households through winter. Fish, pork, grain, and dairy were central resources. These foods fed laborers, sailors, and families. They also reduced dependence on fresh supplies that could spoil or disappear. The Viking household endured dirty conditions, partly because it was always converting perishable life into storable life. Salt, smoke, drying, and fermentation were defenses against hunger and decay. But even there, the dirt fought back. A 2018 study discussed by Science Nordic found that tapeworms were common in Viking and later European populations, and that some infections likely came from eating raw or poorly cooked fish and pork. Ancient latrine DNA from Viking-age Viborg showed persistent parasite burdens, while roundworm and whipworm appeared across long spans of time. In other words, the Viking world's food systems helped people endure winter and scarcity, but they also carried risk. Preservation and preparation could save lives, yet imperfect preparation could infect the body from within. That is the pattern again and again, not purity. Management, not safety. Balance, not victory over filth. A negotiated truce. The archaeological evidence from York even shows how this negotiation changed within the same town. Earlier deposits suggest wetter, dirtier, more insect-heavy environments. Later planked buildings appear cleaner and drier, though still open enough to admit outdoor insects. That shift matters because it shows improvement over time. Viking communities did not simply endure conditions, they learned from them. Urban growth, carpentry, flooring, and waste control could all gradually change the health burden of daily life. And yet the burden never disappeared. The National Museum of Denmark's health summary paints a harsh picture. Skeletons show arthritis in backs, hands, and knees. Many Vikings had severe tooth problems, more than a quarter had cavities, and many lost multiple teeth before death. Other illnesses, not visible in bone, likely included pneumonia and badly inflamed wounds. Infant mortality was high, and most Vikings did not live past 35 to 40. That is what survival looked like. Not comfort, not longevity, but endurance within limits. This is where modern viewers often make a mistake. We ask, how did they survive? As though survival means thriving. For the Vikings, survival often meant something narrower. It meant enough children lived, enough adults worked, enough food was stored, enough sickness was endured, enough filth was pushed to the edge of the house or the pit or the byre, enough washing was done to keep the body socially presentable, enough order was imposed that life could continue. And that enough was a remarkable achievement, because the forces pressing against them were relentless. Smoke harmed the lungs. Parasites invaded the gut. Fleas and lice lived in floors and textiles. Water could be dangerous. Animals brought value and contamination at the same time. Winter made cleaning harder and crowding worse. Even the food that kept people alive could carry hidden threats. Yet the Vikings endured all of this with routines that mixed common sense, habit, and social expectation. And someone had to sustain those routines every single day. The National Museum of Denmark is clear that most Viking women were housewives who managed the farm's housekeeping with a firm hand. When men left on expeditions, the responsibility for securing the harvest and therefore survival fell to women. Their work included making food, working wool, spinning, sewing, and weaving. Children, too, were drawn early into the same system. They looked after the fireplace, helped prepare food, tended animals, gathered firewood, and worked in the fields. This matters because cleanliness in the Viking world was not an abstract ideal. It was labor. Someone had to feed the fire, replace the floor covering, process the wool, fetch the water, prepare the beer, wash the bowl, and move the waste. So when we talk about hygiene, we are really talking about household discipline. And household discipline in the Viking Age was relentless. Wool had to be spun and woven not just for clothing, but for blankets, wraps, sailcloth, and repairs. Food had to be prepared in a room already thick with smoke. Children had to be kept alive in interiors the National Museum compares to open-fire houses where smoke can damage health. Women and young children, the museum notes, were especially vulnerable to those smoky conditions. That means the people most responsible for maintaining the household were often also the people most exposed to its dangers. That is a hard truth behind the romance of the Longhouse. It also explains why the body itself became a site of order. Hair, nails, ears, teeth, and clothing could be controlled in a way that smoke could not. Grooming restored a sense of personhood inside an environment that was always trying to reclaim the body for dirt. The National Museum even notes that a Spanish Arab who visited Hedeby described both men and women wearing makeup to appear younger and more attractive. In other words, appearance mattered not just socially, but psychologically. In a difficult world, looking composed was a way of asserting that life was still functioning. But the body also told the cost of that world. Arthritis in the hands and knees, missing teeth, cavities, likely pneumonia, inflamed wounds, high infant mortality, a life expectancy that often ended before old age could really begin. The Viking body was not protected from hardship, it was shaped by hardship. And that is why the routines around food, warmth, washing, and order mattered so much. Without them, the burden would have been even worse. Look again at the archaeology of the floor. A modern person thinks of the floor as a finished surface. In a Viking house, it was closer to a living zone of constant negotiation. At York, floors preserved traces of human fleas and lice, moldering plant remains, and heavy insect activity. But they also preserved evidence of straw, chaff, woodland litter, moss, heather, bracken, and other materials that may have been used as coverings or bedding. This suggests not a single filthy layer left untouched for years, but repeated episodes of covering, trampling, replacement, and disposal. The floor was renewed because it had to be renewed. And every renewal was a small act of survival. The same pattern appears in waste itself. Viking households did not merely produce refuse, they organized it. The Coppergate pits contained food remains, dog feces, feathers, bread, fish bones, fruits, and sanitary materials. The waste probably accumulated quickly. In other words, waste moved. It was gathered, dumped, and shifted out of the immediate living area. That does not sound heroic, but it is one of the foundations of settled life. Once waste stops moving, disease usually moves in faster. And sometimes the smallest finds are the most revealing. A comb case says grooming mattered enough to protect the comb. A hand-washing bowl with runes says washing before eating may have had recognized social value. A toilet pit says somebody chose separation over chaos. A few fragments of moss in a waste feature say someone thought about comfort, or at least practicality, at the most basic bodily level. These are not grand monuments, they are fragments of attention, but history is often held together by attention. Then there is another uncomfortable detail. Some of the very processes that made Viking life possible may also have made it dirtier. Textile work brought sheep, lice, and keds into settlements. Keeping valuable domestic animals close brought noise, warmth, manure, and insects all at once. Drying and storing food created residues and scraps. Reusing everything meant living close to organic decay. Viking efficiency was real, but efficiency is not the same thing as hygiene. It can keep a household alive while still keeping it messy. That is why modern categories fail here. We want to divide the past neatly into clean and dirty. The Viking world resists that division. It was dirty by modern biomedical standards, yet often organized by social standards that cared deeply about the body, the guest, the table, and the household. A traveler in Havamal is not just fed, he is dried and welcomed. A person in England does not just notice Viking violence, he notices Viking grooming. Ibn Fadlan does not just see washing, he judges the method of washing. Each observer notices something different, because cleanliness is never just about soap and water. It is also about shared rules. And Viking rules were practical rules. Protect the food, warm the body, wash enough to be presentable, move the waste, manage the floor, keep the fire alive, repair what rots, endure what cannot be fixed. That may be the most human detail of all, because real resilience is rarely glamorous. It is the mother covering the floor again, the worker clearing waste, the traveler being given water and a towel, the household brewing weak beer because the water is risky, the host feeding a guest and seating him by the fire, the person pulling a comb through hair in a room that still smells of smoke. That is how societies survive harsh conditions. Not by abolishing discomfort, but by structuring it. And that is why the phrase, "without clean living conditions," needs one last correction. The Vikings did not really live without cleanliness. They lived without modern sanitation. Those are not the same thing. They lacked plumbing, disinfectants, sealed windows, filtered water, germ theory, and dry-heated interiors. But they absolutely practiced forms of cleanliness: combing, bathing, washing hands, using, grooming tools, assigning places for waste, drying the traveler, refreshing the guest, storing food carefully, and maintaining the household with relentless repetition. That is the final twist in the story. The Vikings survived not because they ignored dirt, but because they understood that dirt had to be managed socially, materially, and ritually. Their homes could be smoky, their floors could be damp, their bodies could carry parasites, their towns could smell terrible. Yet their culture still contained strong ideas about grooming, hosting, washing, and maintaining order at the edge of disorder. Archaeology does not give us a spotless Viking world, it gives us a disciplined one. And maybe that is why they lasted, because civilization is not built by perfect conditions. It is built by people who know how to keep living when conditions are bad. The Vikings crossed seas, founded towns, shaped trade routes, and terrified kingdoms. But before all of that, they did something even harder. They woke every morning in a world of smoke, waste, insects, cold, labor, and uncertainty, and they kept their households functioning anyway. They kept the fire going, they protected food, they cleared space for the living, they cleaned just enough, they endured just enough, and across generations, just enough became a civilization.